Well, I just want to say hello, everyone, and thank you to the 𝘜𝘯𝘴𝘪 Museums for having us all here today. I'm Kathryn Bunn-Marcuse, and I am the curator of Northwest Native Art at the Burke Museum, the director of the Bill Holmes Center for the Study of Northwest Native Art, and an assistant professor of art history at the University of Washington. And I am coming to you today from Seattle. I live and work in Coast Salish territory, particularly the lands and shared waters of the 𝘕𝘯𝘓𝘵, 𝘕𝘠𝘓𝘓, 𝘜𝘯𝘴𝘪𝘓, and 𝘕𝘠𝘯𝑚𝑒𝑠ℎ. So I really appreciate being here, and it's been such an amazing process to work with Aldona and with Lou-Ann and all the other contributors to the book that we're going to talk about today, Unsettling Native Art History on the Northwest Coast. And so, Aldona?
I'm Aldona Jonaitis. I'm the retired director of the University of Alaska Museum of the North. Happily living on a farm in Fairbanks, Alaska with horses and goats and chickens and geese and 20 dogs. My husband's a musher. And I live in Athabascan territory. Hello, thank you. Thank you very much. Lou-Ann.
𝘰𝘯𝘓𝘵𝘗𝑙𝑎, 𝘰𝘯𝘓𝘗𝑙𝑎, 𝘰𝘠𝘯𝑃𝑒𝑙𝑎, 𝘰𝘠𝑢𝑡𝑙𝑛 𝑙𝑎 𝑚𝑎𝑚𝑎𝑙𝑖𝑙𝑎 𝑡𝑙𝑢𝑎𝑘𝑤𝑎𝑔𝑔𝑡, 𝘰𝘯𝘓𝘓𝑙𝑎 𝑙𝑒𝑘𝑤𝑎𝑔𝑔𝑡, 𝑙𝑒𝑖𝑙𝑔𝑎𝑙𝑎 𝑘𝑤𝑎𝑔𝑡. My English name is Lou-Ann Neel, and I've just introduced myself as being from the 𝘠𝑚𝑎𝑚𝑎𝑙𝑖𝑙𝑎 and the 𝘠𝑚𝑎𝑚𝑎𝑙𝑖𝑙𝑎 people of the 𝘠𝑗𝑡𝑢𝑎𝑘. I'm originally from Alert Bay, but I've lived most of my life in the territories of the Lekwungen people, and I acknowledge and thank them for always making me feel so welcome in the lands of their ancestors. I work with the Royal BC Museum. My day job is I work with the Royal BC Museum as the repatriation specialist, and I moonlight as an artist. I've been a visual artist most of my life, learning from my grandmother's carvings and her paintings and all of her wonderful adventures, and just picking up where she left off, not only in her art practice, but in arts advocacy as well.
Lou-Ann, can you please tell us who your grandmother was?
Oh, sure. My grandmother was 𝘂𝘂𝑎𝑠𝑜𝑙𝑎𝑠, Ellen Neel, from the Newman family of Alert Bay and Fort Rupert.
Well, the book started actually at a conference, Native American Art Studies Association, which is a conference that's been going on for many decades, and it's a place where scholars of Native art and artists and community members gather every couple of years. And so Aldona and I were at the 2018, is that correct, Aldona? Conference, and she was hosting a session on Northwest Native art. So do you want to say just a little bit about that, Aldona, and our thoughts as we came out of that conference?
Well, it was very interesting because this was sort of new directions and new research on Northwest Coast art. And I'm thrilled that we had several Indigenous speakers at that particular session. And I was thrilled that when it was over, I just stood there and said, these are the most interesting and innovative and forward-thinking contributions on Northwest Coast art that I have heard. Because I mean, I've been in the field for, since the 1970s, and I've seen how it's changed. And there is a sea change in how scholars and Indigenous people have changed the discourse on Northwest Coast art. And so Katie and I had lunch, actually with the director of the University of Alaska Press, University of Washington Press, sorry. And we decided that it would be great to do a collection of essays from this conference because they were so new and so innovative. And Katie, then you developed the book in a very interesting way.
Well, we had this core group of people that had presented at the conference, but that clearly wasn't, didn't really represent the breadth of Northwest Coast research going on today. So we spent a while talking together about who else is really contributing on the Northwest Coast to research and scholarship, museum exhibitions, museum decolonization, and thinking about what were the ways that we really saw things changing on the coast. And so then we reached out to a number of other artists, scholars, community members, knowledge holders to see if they wanted to come together and contribute to this book. So it's not comprehensive. We don't have everyone who works in Northwest Coast Studies, but it's really actually quite a lot. There are 14 chapters plus an introduction that I wrote sort of about the state of the field, and a conclusion that Aldona wrote, which really looks back at a personal history over the last several decades, and that is fascinating. And then within the book, we have 4 parts. The first covers cultural heritage protection, questions of rights and authority, and people are looking at really those questions, working with communities around protection of cultural intellectual property, and fascinating essays from Emily Moore's work on the 𝘕𝘢𝘵 𝘕𝘠𝘯𝘴, a Tlingit counter monument to the Alaska Purchase. Aldona and Janet Berlow wrote a paper on artifacts and surrogates and fakes and replication in Northwest Coast art history. We also have a whole section on women's work, stories, art, and power, which is incredibly important, the role of women. I think we could come back to this and talk about it a little bit more. And we have, it's an area that's really been underrepresented in Northwest Coast Studies. And so 𝘵𝘵𝘭𝘪𝘯𝘵 𝘕𝘠𝘁, who's the curator of the 𝘠𝘬𝘬𝑚 Museum, talks about their strong and long history of presenting exhibitions of women's work, which really comes out of the Haida matrilineal worldview. And there are many other important pieces in that section, including Lou-Ann's work on her grandmother, Ellen Neel, and she can tell us a little bit more about that. In part 3, we have a section on changing museums and a number of curators who are writing on how museums either are working more closely with community, closely with artists, decolonizing the exhibition process, looking at museum archives and working closely with communities on that. And then we have a section called Beyond Art that really addresses sort of a very robust understanding of what art is. And one of the way that I started the introduction of the book is to say that really oft-repeated phrase, there's no word for art in our language. And to say that that's really a pushback against this incredibly limiting definition of art that sometimes we think of that comes out of the Western tradition. But all of the people in this book who are artists and scholars and community members really talk about art specifically, but art in this incredibly robust, indigenously informed perspective that brings in kinship, genealogy, oral histories, relationships between contemporary production, older pieces, and all of the history involved in that. And so this really is, it's an art historical volume, but it really helps us to push back against that incredibly narrow definition of art. I'm not willing to give up the word art. I want it to be big enough to hold all of these indigenous conceptions for art. And then in addition to all those essays, we have 4 wonderful poets who contributed opening pieces to each section of the book. And that's really important because it brings in a whole other conception of coming at the artwork and a way of thinking through art, both through the artworks that we're all talking about and through language and through relationships. And so that's sort of a big general overview of the book. And I'm wondering, Lou-Ann, I know you were one of the people we said, please, could you come in and contribute to this book, and invited what it is that you wanted to talk about. And you work so hard in museums on all of those processes to change institutional practices. But for this one, you really were focusing on your grandmother, Ellen Neel. She's been underrepresented, and the impact perhaps that had on you as an artist coming up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was really, really wanted to bring more light to some of the things my grandmother did in her era, which were, it was a man's world, you know, the things that she was up against. First of all, being married to a non-native, so losing her status, having to move away from the home community, our home community, and live in Vancouver, BC. And so that's where she did a lot of her work. So I think that anyone who might have in that time been studying or wanting to know more about art was either going directly to a museum or directly into our community. So right off the top, she fell between into the information gap. And I think that also because she was raised with 𝘜𝘯𝘴𝘦𝘵 as her first language and a really thorough understanding of our traditions, the fact that she was the oldest child, there was no male heir for the chieftainships or the high-ranking titles that would have ordinarily been passed during that time. So she took on quite a few roles on top of raising 6 kids and taking care of my grandfather, who suffered several strokes and was unable to help anymore. So I thought that that's a pretty powerful story of a powerful woman who didn't get recognized at all. And when I was actually starting to study art, and I talk about this in my essay, that there weren't any women role models, and I really wanted to carve. My hands just couldn't stand it any longer. I needed to carve, and yet the messaging that was coming in my direction to say that girls don't carve and aren't allowed to carve, and I just remember thinking, even without having a female role model, that didn't sound right, because by that age, I was in my teens. I'd already been to quite a few of our potlatches, and saw how important it was for men and women sharing the different roles that are part of our ceremonies and handling these really sacred belongings. So yeah, that was the, I think, motivation for me. And then, and I'm just so thankful that there was so much support along the way to sort of narrow that focus.
It's such an important essay for all the reasons that you list. But also to bring your particular perspective, right? To bring that to, Aldona was one of the first people who really addressed this question of women being left out of the record on Northwest Coast art. And she has an article specifically about this from a while back. And Ellen Neel is one of the people that she talks about. But to bring in that particular, you know, family connection that you have and your expertise as an artist, as the granddaughter, as someone who grew up within the family history of what she did. And then also, I know from our own experience together that you've learned a lot from going into museums and learning through the archives and learning through the collections and the ways in which we all understand that those historical creations are teachers in and of themselves. And I think that's something that a lot of the essays get at in this book and really push back against the sort of objects. These are the objects that we're studying, instead of these are the teachers that we're learning from. And there are ways that I, as a non-native person, can understand that. And there are other ways that you, as the granddaughter of Ellen Neel and the daughter of John Neel, the people whose creations you find in some of these historical collections, that's a whole different kind of understanding. And so making sure that there's room in publications and supporting that is such an important part of expanding Northwest Coast art history in a way that absolutely has to be done. Otherwise, we only get this incredibly sort of small window into it. There are certain things I can bring to the practice that are, you know, stuff that comes from my training, but it's not at all the same as what you're going to bring to the practice.
Yeah, I believe all of my advocacy work stems right from what she wrote in that 1948 address she did at UBC. When I first came across that was when the totem carvers was still in draft manuscript form. Phil Newton brought it by to show my uncle, and I just happened to be visiting that summer, and so I got to read through it. And that was the first time I saw the keynote. So this would have been in the 80s. And so my uncle and I ended up spending that whole trip talking about my grandmother and all the things she did, and his huge respect and regard for her, and all of the things that he, as a male practicing artist who learned from her, how he recognized the advantage that he had, and the dismissal and the leaving her out of all these accounts. So what I did was chat with him, and I made all kinds of notes about what did grandmother really believe about all this, and why did she believe that? And I just really remember him talking about that she was doing this for her grandchildren, and even though some of us were still babies at that time, and the great grandchildren weren't even born yet, it's so much a part of our culture to ensure that you leave behind the wealth that comes from your family to the proper, those who are properly going to inherit these things. And so I thought that was really, really key to understanding and starting to talk about these objects and these really cultural belongings that are in museums. And around that same time, when I was talking with my uncle, I would have been in high school. So I was actually down at what was then the Provincial Museum pretty much every weekend, at the very least, running around the totem poles in Thunderbird Park and exploring the museum. And I used to always look at them and think, gosh, one day I hope I'm allowed to carve one like that, or I hope I'm allowed to at least learn. And I hope I get to work here. And so that eventually did happen. But I think back when I walk through the museum now of all these places I stood as a kid, and the carving studio program that the museum had, where it was pretty much all men. And yet, even in Mungo Martin's time, who was my great uncle, in Mungo's time, he also encouraged women to carve. I mean, he carved and learned alongside my grandmother. So there was those relationships that were already there inside our community, the way we do things. And then there was this external narrative being sort of forced on us about how we were going to tell our own story. And that really bothered me. And that Kwakiutl blood started boiling. And I thought, I know some pretty amazing women artists, and I think they deserve as much recognition and support. And I was really disappointed over the years to not see more art classes or mentorship and apprenticeship opportunities for women and young girls. So that became really the heart of my advocacy work, but also just trying to make sure that Indigenous artists are supported, not only through the early learning, emerging type of start of their careers, but right through into their careers, and balancing the traditional role of artists with contemporary opportunities for artists.
I love
Yes.
that piece that your grandmother, the speech that she gave, and those pressing issues to really make more opportunities for artists to respect their knowledge, to respect the cultural property, but also to make commercial opportunities available to them. And, she was so involved at UBC, and unfortunately, as we were just discussing, her involvement is not as well known as Mungo Martin and others who worked with museums. But I wondered if this was a moment, Aldona, if you could pipe in and talk about maybe that change that you see from the days when you worked at American Museum of Natural History and having that experience of working closely with community in one of the really early great collaborative moments of chiefly feasts, and then some of those issues that you saw then that maybe still exist in the field.
Okay, this is really interesting because I used to work at the American Museum of Natural History, which of course is a big East Coast elitist institution that has a huge collection of Kwakiutl art, material culture too. And I thought that it would be very wonderful to do an exhibit on the potlatch. And so I traveled to the Northwest, and I had a conversation with Michael Ames, who was one of the most important and innovative museum directors, I think, anywhere. He was at MOA, Museum of Anthropology, and he and his team had collaborated often with Indigenous people in the exhibits. And he said to me when I talked to him, he said, you need to have a collaborator. You need to work with the 𝘜𝘯𝘴𝘦𝘵. You need to have Gloria Cranmer-Webster as your co-curator. And so I said, absolutely, that's great. So I went up to Alert Bay, met her. We ended up collaborating. We ended up collaborating with a group of old people, as she called them. And it was the most transformational experience for myself. But also, it was the first time that I think any 𝘜𝘯𝘴𝘦 people had entered the American Museum of Natural History since George Hunt, who worked with Franz Boas, was there since 1905. And there were a few other museums, including yours, including the Burke Museum, at about that time that were beginning to collaborate. And since then, it has become de rigueur for all museums, if they're doing an exhibit on Indigenous or Native American, Native Canadian art, to include co-curators. And the difference is, though, that when I did this, the exhibit opened in 1989, 1990. I'm too old to remember these dates. And about 1990. And, you know, I was still the person in charge. And that was the mode that white anthropologists and art historians, museum people had. Well, the great thing that has changed is that the power structure, and of course that power structure is colonialist. And over the years, that power structure has changed. And the voice of the creators of the art itself has become much louder. And the role of non-Native people like myself and Katie is to certainly contribute our training, as you mentioned before, Katie, but also to provide a safe space and a space which can be shared with the public for the voices of the people whose culture it is. That has really changed. The change of the power structure, I think, with the whole decolonization movement is a major change. I mean, would you agree with that, Katie?
I would agree that the power structures have changed and that there's certainly much more room, and that you don't have to fight as hard, you know, to have collaboration. It's, as you say, it's the expected way to do things. But we still work in colonial institutions, and there's still elitist hierarchies. And I think we've done a lot of work to make them much better, much more friendly places. And I think there are ways that we're still very much pushing back, ways that we're still working on. The Burke has been known for many decades as a place that's very accessible, that communities can come and visit with collections with their cultural heritage. But we are still working towards, you know, who has authority, who gets paid for their labor, all of those kinds of questions. And, you know, it's step by step. And so, Lou-Ann, I would love, I know this isn't what you contributed to the book, but if you want to say a little bit about the changes that you've seen at the Royal British Columbian Museum through your work in the Repatriation Department, and even the fact that what used to be ethnology now lives in the Repatriation Department, are showing some major structural changes. And I'd love to just hear a little bit about that if you'd be willing to talk.
Oh, absolutely. My favorite thing to talk about, because we're right in the midst of it. Well, first of all, yes, you're right. The anthropology, archaeology, and ethnology departments were merged to become the Indigenous Collections and Repatriation Department. One of the first things that happened was that the department helped to establish an Indigenous Advisory and Advocacy Committee. And that committee wasn't just to support this particular department, but the whole museum. And so the first step that we call them IAC did, and I was a member of IAC before I jumped the fence and went to work for the museum, was to redo what was then the Aboriginal Material Operating Policy and update it. So we now have the Indigenous Collections and Repatriation Policy, which talked about repatriation very much being the focus of this department's work, and that we would continue to just grow and figure out what that meant and what it meant to each community. So my role was to come in and work specifically with communities who had already started a request for repatriation. There was no template, there was no list of things, top 10 things to do. There were examples of repatriations having happened in the past and in different museums. So I just talked with different museums that had done a little bit of that work, especially with ancestral remains, and started to put together, and I'm still actually working on the actual step-by-step process. Now, before I got there, Lucy Bell from the HIDA was our head of the department. And one of the first things she did, which really, I think, shook a lot of people in the museum that were accustomed to things being done a certain way, she had, because she had done so much work with the HIDA on repatriating ancestral remains from around the world, she really knew the kind of cultural work that needed to happen. And so taking all of the ancestors out of these, we call them baggies with twist ties and mounds of styrofoam, and had them all unwrapped and rewrapped in fabric and with prayers and with the assistance of the local First Nations healers and cultural workers. And then they did a burning to let the energies of those ancestors know that they were going to be going home soon and that they would be properly cared for and differently cared for from here on out. So she did all of that work, and the big shocker was the burning $1,000 worth of food that caught a few people by surprise. But for the community, the weight, I think, started to be lifted away. They felt like they were being heard, and there were over 1,200 ancestral remains at that time. We're just under 600 now, so we're over the halfway mark. But those communities who Lucy communicated with and said, we're going to do this work with the assistance of local First Nations, and just reaching out and doing that and letting people know that we were going to do these things properly. The next thing we're doing right now is, I'll speed ahead because there was so much we did in the last just 2 years, is recognizing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Now for BC, the British Columbia legislature last November also passed an act called the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. And this new legislation compels every government department and every government agency attached to the province of BC to update all of their respective legislation and policies and procedures to align with the UN Declaration. So this is a very exciting time. I've done an initial analysis of what that would look like for the Royal BC Museum. That will go to our Indigenous Advisory Committee for their feedback. And then we'll share it out across the museum and begin a series of discussions internally about how every single step we do could be impacted by, it's called the 𝘠𝘯𝘴. It's not the best acronym, 𝘠𝘯𝘴. So that work's being done. And in addition to that, we really recognized from some of the work we did last year, specifically with artists, to bring artists in, make sure they have really good access, not only to the collections, but they spend some time online selecting pieces that they want to study. Just sort of partially under the umbrella of repatriation for communities who felt that they wanted to leave belongings in the museum, especially if they're really fragile and they're not sure that they have a place for it yet. One of the steps we're doing is to clarify ownership of the piece first. one of the elders that was in a couple months ago said, just before COVID, said, you know, when I started this process, I was a young man, and now look at me. I'm an old man, I'm a senior, I'm an elder, and I don't want my grandchildren having to fight this same fight. So what I want is, you know, and he said, the white man's piece of paper that clarifies who owns this, I want that first. And then we'll talk about where the things belong. So I brought the artists in from different nations to look at pieces that they could possibly replicate. One of the things that we run into with all the museums is this idea that if there were anything to be repatriated, it could only be repatriated to another entity, not to an individual. And there's probably lots of good reasons for that. So rather than spend a whole lot of time trying to figure out and retrace the steps and find out who the items belong to, we suggested that the artists come in, and as an artist, I've done that myself. I've gone and looked at museum pieces that came from my family and replicated them, and then gifted them back into the potlatch system so that they could be used again where they're supposed to be. And so we're doing a lot of work around that. The other piece, the last piece, is on intellectual and cultural property and copyright, and really bringing those up to modern terminology and understanding, and really opening a door to a whole new discussion around the fact that copyright doesn't actually align with a lot of our values and a lot of our shared rights over different things. So we have quite a few things on the go right now. And what's really exciting is that our CEO is very much leading this and very vocal about how repatriation has to be our top priority. And how we go about addressing the UN Declaration is going to be probably the next year or so is going to be very intense discussions about that.
Thank you. That's such a great overview of the way that RBCM is changing what's happening at your institution. And I'm always looking to BC and Canada because it feels like you're quite a number of steps ahead sometimes of where we are in the States in terms of recognizing Indigenous sovereignty and recognizing the colonial traumas and how that really still exists in our institution. And one of the things that I appreciate learning from your program is we know that repatriation and decolonization, those are very specific terms that at their core mean returning the actual creations that came out of communities, returning the ancestors themselves, and in terms of decolonization, returning land. But in terms of how our institutions operate, you know, we have this larger concept that I think that we're all working on in terms of working together, collaborating on the repatriation of knowledge, of authority, particularly. And I know that you talked about if anyone doesn't know, Royal British Columbia Museum has just put all of their digital images online. You can search for them. And those have been very widely, freely given out in large batches back to community. And this is such an important part of, you know, how institutions are changing, right? I think a lot of institutions have made access more easier to get to. You can come, you can visit some museums, the Burke Royal British Columbia Museums, and others have programs, grants for artists to come in and study, but really to understand that authority, as you're talking about, over how those collections, how that those belongings and creations are treated. You know, do they need to have certain ceremonial protocols around them? How are we going to keep them safe and also acknowledge that we're just helping to keep them safe, but really those decisions need to sit with community members, and then extending that out into exhibits, starting with things like Chiefly Feast back in the 90s and the authority around how that was going to be interpreted, and a lot of exhibits that have come along today. I know Royal British Columbia Museum's done they have their big language exhibit, right? So to think about the fact that we don't always have to focus on the material collections, we can focus on those larger conceptions of language and Indigenous knowledge that doesn't have to be tied to a material piece. And I think in the volume, we tried to acknowledge that as well, sort of through the poems and through the other kinds of making space for things that go beyond what we think of as sort of the artwork itself. I came from the training, I was trained by Bill Holm and Robin Wright, so I got a lot of formal analysis and learned about attribution and form and how, you know, how does that all work. And in the larger field, there's a lot of pushback against formal analysis, that it looked at artworks without taking into the whole cultural context and all of the meaning and behind it. And that is an absolutely valid criticism for certain types of scholarship. But what's always amazing to me is that the artists are the most informed, knowledgeable, geeky, nerdy, focused on form line, formal analysis, how design systems work. They are the experts. They know, you know, if you read some of Robert Davidson's writing in the Charles Edenshaw book, that is formal analysis as deep as you can go. But it's also placed into that whole Haida epistemology. He understands, why do these things come together? Why does this ovoid form have this energy in relation to other things? And I know that Aldona's looked at some of this in her examinations of like Tlingit screens and how those represent certain kinds of Tlingit concepts around balance and reciprocity. Lou-Ann, I know you could talk about this for weeks, so we could come back to that, but I just want to acknowledge that there's this incredible sort of coming together of those two kinds of knowledge and scholarship, that I think there's a place for that now. When we're talking about unsettling art history, we have to really think about, well, that comes from understanding the idea of settler colonial construct. And so understanding that I, as a settler scholar, participate in that, and that means I have to understand what are those colonial histories, and I need to be responsible to those, to work with community, to take priority from community, to understand where my research is invited and where it is not appropriate, or the places where people wonderfully share in incredibly generous ways with me, but that won't necessarily make it onto the page that I write. It helps me understand, but there are things that are not for me to write about. And so that is part of what I think unsettling is understanding those histories. Of course, it's re-examining older scholarship, which is has always been a part of scholarship, but re-examining it under the lens of that responsibility and accountability to Indigenous communities. It's to understand that Native artists with their creations were history makers. That's their history, and that is their visual language. It's the written language of Northwest Coast art history. Unsettling means unlearning. I have to unlearn some of the things that I learned, you know, about how to do research or what counts as authoritative voice, and changing that. I have unlearned some of that and learned new ways of how that should be. I think that's part of unsettling. And you see that through so many of the essays in the book. What is authority? So bringing in direct Indigenous authors, or understanding how older pieces, even if they're oral histories, were filtered through the anthropologists or art historians that wrote those earlier volumes, and maybe sometimes reading against the grain or looking for ways that you can work with community to really help that filtering process get unfiltered again. And mostly accountability. I think really part of it is just understanding that research needs to include respect, reciprocity, relationships. And the book is really about relationships. Every single chapter, I think, is grounded in relationships. And that probably was the thing, I think, Aldona, you could let me know, that came across so strongly in those first talks that we heard and the other invited pieces. So Lou-Ann, do you want to pick up on a few of those things, what you think unsettling art history might mean?
Oh, absolutely. Unsettling. For me, art history from a 𝘜𝘯𝘴𝘦𝘵𝘵 lens in the first place is not just the history of the art. It's about this broader relationships, like you mentioned. It is our full history. It's social, it's political, it's economic, it's cultural. It speaks to individual, family, and tribal roles, responsibilities, obligations, duties, the things we all have that are connected to our names. So our name will sort of define who we are in our own larger system and our own governance system, but also how our roles, responsibilities, obligations to make, if we have the ability, if we have the artistic ability to create things for ceremony, creating those things, doing them properly and well, to honor somebody and to lift them up, to lift up their name. So this idea of making your name good and upholding your name is really important. And you don't get that if you just look at an object just as an object. You don't see how much, like you can see in the background there, there's my moose hide cape that I did, or rather elk hide cape that I did for ceremony, because on my 𝘠𝘯𝘴 side, I have every right to wear that. But I didn't know that until I did my research on button blankets and started talking with some of the old ladies. We call them old people and old ladies. So talked to some of the old ladies, and they said, you know, everybody thinks that all we ever had was button blankets. We had elk hide and moose, we had and cedar bark. And your family comes from that line of greatness, and you should be wearing a cape made of hide, and you should be telling your story. So this figure you can see there is the 𝘠𝘯𝘴, the young Thunderbird, and that comes from my lineage on the Neel Newman side. So for me to be able to honor and recognize and show everybody in our potlatch system that I understand where I come from, that I can create something like this, wear it with honor, and let everybody know who I am and who my parents and grandparents are, I think that is our art history. That's me carrying and wearing my art history for a purpose. And in ceremony, that enables me then to carry out certain transactions under our whole political and governance system. So I think it's really so much richer to be able to broaden our lens and say the art history part's very valid. There's lots of different strings that flow from that, but there are also even more strings leading out to how it is in context. And especially where we are now in our modern world, there's so much about our traditions that was taken away and lost to memory. You know, our old people are gone, and some of those, that really important knowledge went with them. But when we look at the different art pieces, if we really understand and know how to create them, we'll be able to surface more of the meaning on a personal and family level if we've had some of that time to study the works themselves and see what's different. You can see a mask that might be created and just put up on a wall versus one that's fully articulated and meant to be danced. And how it moves and why it moves and when it moves, at what part in the song with which lyric, you can see how it gets so interconnected that the beak of a bird to only tap a little bit because that bird is sending a specific message versus a different one that I might make more fully articulated. So there's just so much more to it, I think, that we can learn from.
Aldona, do you want to say something about unsettling art history?
I do. I was just thinking about this. As an art historian, when I began my studies, which was in the early 70s at Columbia University, nobody studied Native art history. And in a department that was, you know, medieval and 19th century and Renaissance and Baroque, there was a discrimination against the art of non-Western or non-high culture, or for want of a better word, you know, like Asian and Indian and things like that. And this was in the late 60s, early 70s, and many intellectuals belonged to the radical part of politics. And this is true of many of the other art historians, Ruth Phillips, Janet Berlow, the three of us are best friends. We all engaged in this discipline as a political, in addition to loving the art, as a political expression of saying, wait a minute, this art of people who have been oppressed for centuries and abused and so on and so forth is a wonderful kind of art. And you who disregard it have got to look at it and realize that it is as good, and I think better, than Western art. So that, in a funny way, was trying to unsettle art history in a way way back. And as the history has changed, the notion of unsettling, which is a political notion, the history of understanding Northwest Coast art and Native art in general and Indigenous art around the world has been a process of politically figuring out how to raise the voices of the people who made the art in one way or another. And it has strengthened over the years, and it's much more conscious now and much more universally recognized than it was in those days. So unsettling art history is something that those of us who have been in the field for such a long time are, and even now, I believe in my old age that I still want to give whatever I can for this project in whatever way I'm working with Tlingit now, young contemporary Tlingit artists, whichever way they would like to be represented, they would like to share in the process. So that's art history, unsettling art history. And you have to remember there's a strong political message in there.
It's so important for students of this history, whether they're young community members and artists or they want to be historians. One of the things that I worry about, having put this book together, is who's coming next. I have Aldona's view from her end of the field. I'm kind of in the middle now, and I'm very worried about who's coming up next. And so I really want to encourage students to go and study art history, study anthropology, museum studies. We need you. We need them to come into the field, to be the next people who are going to work at the Burke, at Royal British Columbia Museum, at American Museum of Natural History, work with communities, teach in the universities. And so I invite people, please come to the University of Washington and work with me. We have wonderful artists who come to the Burke, who participate. And we need this next generation of scholars, whether you're going to University of Washington, University of British Columbia, University of Alaska. Please get interested in art history and let those of us know in the field what we can do to support you.
And I must say, I mentioned earlier that American Museum of Natural History was elitist in the 90s. They have changed completely. They have agreed to take down the racist, insensitive statue of Theodore Roosevelt, flanked by an African and a Native American. And that shows tremendous change. And they are also renovating their Northwest Coast Hall with the active involvement of people, of Indigenous people from the Northwest Coast. So things really are changing. And the fact that the American Museum of Natural History can change is critical. And I couldn't agree more with you, Katie. We need more scholars and we need more Indigenous people going to graduate school. Lou-Ann, what do you think about this?
Agree with all of the above. And I always really encourage our young people to this was one of my grandmother's agendas as well, post-secondary education, go do it, own it. And I think what's really exciting for me is just in my time at post-secondary so far, a lot of the ways that I would go about thinking about museums and their potential is entirely different than it was even 5 years ago. So I think I really encourage our young people to pursue their education, but also, you know, bring with you that little bundle that you come of your community, where you come from. I think that our research methodologies are the way we look at everything, the kinds of questions we ask, why we ask them, how we hear them, is so different from people who aren't from inside our culture. And I think that there's a whole new way of going about this that we're going to see develop. We've got so many young people that are politically active right now, especially in BC. There's so much going on here. So I really want to harness that energy and just ride along with this next generation. They're smart, they're sharp, they're on it, they're excited about it, and they want their history back. And what I'm excited about on the museum side is we've been working with the province of BC for the last 2 years, and much longer before that, but the specific proposal to redo the actual museum buildings. And I think we're just a few weeks away now from hearing the official word on which one of those building options are going to happen. But a lot of that discussion has been around, how are we going to do these exhibits differently? And I'm really looking forward to the first thing on my agenda is to make sure that our relationships with the communities whose belongings are in this museum, that the relationships are strong, that we can have discussions about how or whether they want things out on display any longer, how those stories are told, who's narrated. I think it's going to completely turn the way we've been doing museum business at this museum. And I think it's just going to be so much richer. Our whole learning center, our public programs, research, our connections with post-secondary institutions who send their students to come and do their research, their internships and co-ops. It's just enormous amount of opportunity. And I'm looking forward to that because I've spent my whole life, spent the last 50 years walking this property and thinking, now that we get to completely switch it, if the sky's the limit, what are we going to do first? So those relationships, I think, are going to be the most important thing. And I think that our young people already who've come to the museum to do their internships have great ideas. And we're just going to keep pulling those together and talking it through with them. Thanks.
Fantastic. Well, you guys, you've given us a lot of food for thought, and thankfully we have the book to reflect back on to kind of answer some more of those questions. But I want to thank you all for joining us and talking a little bit about the book and your own portions in it, Lou-Ann. Thank you very, very much.
May I just interject there? It's also on Kindle. You can go to Amazon and get the book on Kindle.
Ooh.
So you don't have to wait for it to come in the mail.
Nice, nice. Although I know for those listening here in 𝘜𝘁𝘂, our local bookstores do have copies. So
very good.
It's always good to have them available for that instant gratification. You've got your Kindle, or you can get a copy for your bookshelf for sure.
And the last thing I want to say is that I want to thank Alison Bremner for her amazing raising work, which I think makes this, in my opinion, like the most beautiful Northwest Coast art cover that I could imagine. So thank you, Alison.
Yay.